Right, so what you're looking at here is my new server build. Now the idea here is I'm going to create a music server, and I've been doing a lot of research around this kit, and the idea, as always, is to prove or disprove to myself, and perhaps you'll find this useful as well, to see how good a music server can be and whether or not it's worth investing in one. So to do that, I've decided that I will look at creating one based on the information on Audiophilestyle. This is basically I would call it a subjectivist focused forum. It doesn't focus too much on measurements, although people do discuss those. There's a lot of conversations about what things sound like as opposed to how things measure. Some people won't like that. I'm personally okay with it. I do value measurement. I think it's useful to be able to measure things, but I also like to use my ears. So this is from, I'm trying to get a timescale for this, but probably about between 6 to 8 months worth of research from all sorts of different posts. There are very complicated posts on there that go on for thousands and thousands of replies, where people have started off creating servers, and then they've moved on and they've found new parts and they've discovered new things. And there are also different approaches on this forum. So what I've done here is I've assembled a system that represents pretty much what most people are talking about building, and I will highlight where I've deviated from that. In the main, I've cut costs a little bit in some areas just to keep the price down, but we're still talking about a server build that's going to cost over £5,000. So from that perspective, it is very expensive. Now, what have I got in front of me? I've deliberately not unpacked everything here. I'm just going to walk you through a few odds and ends that are part of my spec. Now, over on the left-hand side, you can see the brown box there. This is the HDPlex H5. I'll just get a bit closer to it. This is the new case that they've created. This is the version 3, and it is passively cooled. So, starting with this one, the idea here is that we have got no fans in the computer, and you can see here I've just opened this. There are no fans in this computer. The idea being that any sort of vibration or fans, etc., is going to create problems for the sound. Now, again, I will be very clear about this. I'm not claiming to know exactly what is going to happen with having fans in or not having fans in, etc. I am simply following recipes that have been already created and optimized so that I can replicate that in my own system. I think from a science perspective, that's the best I can do. There's no point me creating something which people don't recommend, and there are people that have put enormous amounts of time into these builds. Now, here you can see this is just the heat pipe system for the HDPlex. Very large, and I'm going to open this just quickly to show you some of the contents. Hopefully the camera will work. Right, and under here you can see part of the kit. Now, the way this works is you have these heat pipes, which are basically solid copper. The pipes here are attached to the sides of the case, which are big heat sinks. So the case itself cools the CPU, and this is the very heavy copper block that sits on top of the processor, and you can see there, if I can get the camera right, the ridges for the heat pipes to fit into. And obviously on the back, which I'm not going to remove, this is the part that goes directly onto the CPU. This in itself, just this little unit here, is a kilogram worth of weight, and I think the original, or version 2, was about 400 grams, so the passive cooling capability of this case is much higher than the old one. And there you can see the piece that goes on top. This is what you'll end up seeing. That goes on top of the copper, and the heat pipes go underneath here. So that is the HDPlex. Now, just moving us over to the right, you can also see here, and I'm going to see if I can zoom in a little bit on this one, or at least pick it up. the HDPlex power supply for the computer. So this one here, which is very heavy, and there's not much to see on the front. On the back here, which you can just about make out, we've got all the connectors. Now, what this has is a set of, let's see if that's better. What this has is a set of PC connectors on it. So what it's going to do for me, I just scroll down a bit, fighting with the technology. What it's going to do for me is allow me to plug this directly into the motherboard, and you can see down here are computer connectors. Now these two here, these two XLRs, which actually have variable voltage, are typically used to drive the audio cards, and I'll show you those in a minute. So here are the cables that come with this unit. These aren't too bad, I don't think. What I've also got, as people are claiming that cables make a big difference, is a set of cables to be made up, and this is using some very expensive silver cable, lots of the obviously raw connectors, and I will at some point try and see if there's a difference between creating your own, I would say these are about £100 a metre or so, creating your own cables versus using some decent quality ones. Okay, so moving us over now, and I mentioned these a second ago, to the cards. So these are made by JCAT. Both of these cards are not their top of the range. They're very good, but there are more expensive versions out there. So this JCAT you've got here is the USB card, and hopefully that's visible. You can see obviously the two USB ports, and also here you've got the DC input, which takes a 5-volt signal, and that's what we looked at before, that the power supply here can provide power to. So the idea being, I can power this from the computer, or I can choose to power it from separate power. Now, why would I want to do that? Well, generally speaking, the idea is that if you've got high quality external power supplies, then you're going to find better delivery of electricity to these units. What I will be running, which is currently being modified, is a Jacobs DC3. So I'm actually not going to use the HDPlex. As good as it is, I think this unit retails for around £800, something like that. The Jacobs is a higher end power supply, probably about double the price actually, just to run these JCATs. You can even go higher than that. The Jacobs DC4, which is very big, runs at around £6,000, which is incredibly expensive for a CPU, for a power supply, but I'm not going to go that expensive. So here's the network card. I'll just rattle away. Again, another JCAT. You see the heat sinks on this one. There's the connector for the motherboard, which I'm not going to use. This is the 4-pin connector. Again, here's my Ethernet, and I've got my power supply at the bottom. So not bad. There is I think it's called the XE version, which is about double the price. But I'm going to start with that one. I think that's a decent card to play with. Now, there is a big conversation going on about whether or not we should be using Ethernet through what we call copper, which is standard Ethernet cables, or whether or not we should be using optical. So some people prefer these things. This is actually a optical network card, and you can see here you would put you put one optical unit in here, and you would send that from a router or from a switch that's got optical on it, so you got optical to optical. Now, the idea behind optical is that optical doesn't carry any noise in it. That's the basics of it. So it's not going to carry electrical noise, but as with everything, the converters that turn the electricity into optical, and more importantly turn it back into electricity, if they're not done very well, you can end up with a messed up signal, and that's the theory behind it. So to get a good version of this, and this is a very cheap one which I probably won't use, which is called the Solarflare X2522, which is extremely low jitter, very high quality. Obviously not an audio device, it's a network device designed for high-end computing. Runs at a maximum of, I think, £1,500, so very expensive. So it's kind of a choice between going with Ethernet with this kind of stuff or going with optical. For now I will go with the standard JCAT, basically because I've got one and it costs nowhere near as much as that Solarflare. Moving us on to processors and motherboards and all of those things. What I've got here, and this is an interesting point in itself, is a very high powered Intel. Now there are schools of thought here where people talk about what's best for my sound quality. Is it a very low powered computer, which is basically typically a motherboard and chip combined, you know, that you don't need to buy them separately. It doesn't take much power. You often see these, certainly in the cheaper servers. Is it one of those? And the idea there is that they produce less EMI, which is a type of electrical radiation, I think it is. So the idea is that, you know, inside the computer you want to keep that down to minimum. Or, and this is the alternate approach, do I want the most powerful chips I can get my hands on? Things like this brand new Intel i9, this is the 12th gen, so this is very expensive. But then I want to run these at extremely low load. So the idea being, I'm not going to stress the chip at all. So if you aren't upsampling, by that I mean taking something like a CD quality signal and boosting that to, let's say, DSD 256. If you're not upsampling, then the idea is you would still want to run one of these because it's not being stressed. Now, obviously, if you are upsampling, then you're going to need a reasonably powerful computer, especially when you start adding things in like or DSPing your room, so basically putting EQ on your room. There are units that can do that. But in this case, I will try upsampling, so I've got a very high powered one, but I also want to see whether or not this is the right approach. Onto motherboards. Now, this one here, this is the new DDR5 supporting Z690. So this is the new type of board that supports these Intel processors. And from that side of things, it's pretty cutting edge. I have Vengeance RAM from Corsair. Deliberately not spent too much on this RAM. They tend to come in 32 gigabytes. Almost certainly won't need that amount of RAM, but that's just what DDR5 is coming in now. It's generally not 16 gigabytes. And then I've gone for something plain. I don't want lights all over this. It has a heatsink on it, as you can see. There are people that have compared, certainly on the DDR4, spent a lot of time comparing different types of RAM, ECC, non-ECC, different types of RAM as well. For DDR5, there's very little research on whether or not these things sound different. And again, I will repeat my point here. I have no proof. This is just what I've been reading. So I've gone for one which is a reasonable price, not too expensive, and we'll work it with the motherboard. So onto the motherboard itself. So this is the Gigabyte Aorus Pro. Not a lot to see here. It's quite a plain board. Again, no fans on it. This is all passively cools. You can see just about anyway through this, you can see very large heat sinks on it. So the idea here is you're looking for a board that's got obviously the passive cooling, but a decent quality power. So usually you'll see on motherboards like the number of, I think it's called the number of phases or number of channels that the power supply supports. You can go crazy with these things. The top-end gaming computers have got incredible power in them. The motherboards now are selling for over £800, so you know you can spend crazy money on these things. The idea with overclocking, obviously, is that you're putting more voltage through. Your computer needs an incredibly stable power supply in order for you to be able to clock it. In our case, we're just looking for some really good power, so we're getting power as cleanly as possible through the board. So it's a slightly different requirement, but the decent power supplies should do the same thing. Now, one of the reasons I've gone for this one is because the case supports ATX. which is what I want. It's designed for ATX. Now eATX is out. You can get one of these into this case. I think it will fit. In fact, I've seen someone do it. But I really want plug and play. I don't want to be messing around. It's not specifically designed for that motherboard, so it's easier to go for ATX. The other thing about this is, because of the case having passive cooling, there is a problem with having a lot of high capacitors around the CPU, in the sense that it literally won't fit, so you will not be able to get the cooling block on if you've got those really high capacitors very close to that CPU block. That's just the design of the case, so that limits you a little bit. There is very little information about this motherboard. I think Gigabyte, that's in terms of audio. The Gigabyte are a decent manufacturer. I don't have any issues with obviously the quality. So that's one of the other reasons. And finally, the final reason is this contains a graphics card. Now, I'm not going to use the graphics card for very much. It's just basically to get this set up. So this will act as a server. I'm not going to have a screen on this, but not having to put a graphics card into this, set it up, and then take it out and all the rest of the nonsense, it's much easier. I can just connect to the motherboard, see what I'm doing. Once the software is set up, I'm done. So that's kind of why I've gone for this, and so that explains the motherboard choice. Right, so that's a kind of entry. In the next session I'm going to talk a little bit about power, and we're going to cover some of the more advanced options with power. So you can see here, I've been talking, if I move this out of the way, I've been talking about the HDPlex. This is mid-range, I would say, in terms of what you can do with power. Going up from this, and some of the kit is currently in the post, you have the Tyco DX-ATX converter, which requires what's called an unregulated power supply. Now, this is where you start to get very expensive. So this linear power supply here should do a decent job and give me at least a version 1 of this server. There are better power options. So this first test, I think, will be simply how good is this in its current form. But undoubtedly, when Tyco arrives and I sort myself out with an unregulated power supply, this should take an uplift in quality if the forums are right. Just wanted to very quickly cover my existing setup, just so you get a view of what I'm running here. Now, this is the Aorus Femto, which I think is around the £2,000 mark, and if I look towards the right, not the one in the middle but on the end, you can see it has its own dedicated power supply. So this is, I don't know, mid to high range. Nothing wrong with it. There are better versions from the Aorus. I think there's a G2.1, if I remember rightly. They do higher end kit. This is basically what I'm going to be comparing against. Now, I did have the Jacobs DC3 powering this, which, as I've said, is a very good power supply. That is being modified to run the network and USB cards. But all in all, this was a pretty decent setup. On the DAC side, I've got the Lampesator Golden Gate 2. I also have some cheaper DACs, so if you look at my other channel videos, you'll see a comparison with the Soncos, which is a much cheaper DAC. But again, this is some quite serious kit. Down here, I have the Audio Research Reference 6. So not much to say about those really. They're very well renowned. This one has, I tweaked the valves slightly, there's a few NOS valves in and so on, but generally speaking, a very well respected preamp. At the bottom, some slightly older valve amps. So these are the Audio Research V140s, so quite big monoblocks. Moving over to the speakers, you can see these. Again, there's a video reviewing these on my channel. This is the Focal Scala Utopia. Quite a large speaker, I've got to be honest. Goes down to, very cleanly down to 25 Hertz, certainly from my measurement. So what am I saying about this? Well, this kit is pretty good in terms of being able to evaluate something like this server. If I wasn't running high-end kit, I guess I could draw conclusions about it being good or not good, but I want to give it the best chance possible by making sure that the ancillary kit is up to scratch.